Dogodek bo potekal v angleščini, ker imamo dva gosta iz tujine, tako da bomo kar preklopili na angleščino. So, welcome to the event and thank you to all three for being here. The event is titled The Future of the Welfare State, Models of Enhancement in the Era of Decay. It's organized by the political desk of Radio Student and in cooperation with the International Center of Graphic Arts. So, we're going to talk about three models of the welfare state. One, which probably most of the people here have already heard of, is the idea of a universal or unconditional basic income, although it has not been yet implemented anywhere on a large scale. The second is also familiar to everyone here, and that is the concept of universal basic public services. That's a new name put on something we already know. And the third idea is a job guarantee idea, so the idea where the state provides paid and decent employment to everyone seeking it. Basically, should the state provide income, jobs, or services, or possibly all three, and where these three models can complement each other. So we have three guests here. Dr. Valeria Korošec is a researcher at the Institute for Macroeconomic Analysis and Development, UMAR in Slovenian, and the Slovenian representative in the Unconditional Basic Income Europe network, and a proponent of UBI. Andrew Percy is a co-director of the Social Prosperity Network at the University College of London, and the author of a report which argues for the expansion of public services. And Dr. Oliver Picek is the former lecturer, right, at the Vienna University of Business and Economics, and a researcher at the European Trade Institute, and a proponent of the job guarantee scheme. So, warm welcome to everyone. Now, before we begin, maybe just a logistical note. So we'll have around an hour of discussion, structured discussion, then we'll open the questions from the audience, so do prepare them. Now, the first question to all three would be, how does your utopia look like? And you can use this answer to present the basic premise of your argument, but please also do include what's the end goal it leads to. Who'd like to start?
Sure. Okay, that's working. Good afternoon, everybody. I suspect that the idea of what a utopia looks like is not terribly different between anybody. We're happy people living in a prosperous society. What I think is going to be difficult about getting there is the next 30 years in particular, where we face, I think, two existential challenges. One is climate change, and the other is maintaining peaceful democracies. And so my utopia is that we get through the next 30 years and that we have dealt with climate change and that we still live in peaceful democracies. And that is what the real core thinking behind our proposal for universal basic services is about, is what are the conditions that need to exist in a society, and those are political, economic conditions, as well as social conditions, that would allow us to make that transition. So I think that while I understand that the term universal basic services might remind some people, particularly here in Slovenia or in other countries more in Eastern Europe, of a past, I would point out that I think that there is quite a big difference between what we're proposing and that model. And the example I would give you is that in any of the areas in which society operates predominantly to give a contract between the individuals and the society, that it is not 100% one way or the other, and that perhaps the problem, one of the foundational problems of the concept of a communist system was that it saw things quite black and white. So, as has already been pointed out, we sort of come from the West and we're talking about increasing public services. And from that mental attitude where our public services have never been at 100%, they've been much higher than they were today, we are talking about bringing them back to a level, but not to 100%. The vision in universal basic services, which I think is better titled, but it runs off the tongue less easily, would be universal access to basic services. So that the proposal is simply that there is a floor in society below which people do not fall, and that we create that floor not by handing out cash predominantly, but we do that mostly by providing a set of access to services that would create that floor in our society. And I hope that as we go on through the discussion this evening, that what we'll see is that there is indeed, I think, a lot of tie-in between these ideas. We'll get around to talk, I think, about what the labor market impacts, for instance, are of universal basic services, which attempt to drive the cost of living down and therefore potentially make new jobs or different jobs or jobs at different levels of pay more worthwhile or more accessible. And so I think the welfare system is the heart of any society in many ways. It's the heart in an emotional sense, that it's where we care, but it also has to be practical, and it has to fit inside the boundaries of that society. And I don't think anybody agrees to be a member of a society voluntarily and give up 100% of their freedom. Nor do I believe, or that even if they do, that's not a functional society, and that people don't give up 100% of their income. People are prepared to pay a certain amount of tax, but not much more than that. People are prepared to give up a certain amount of freedom, but not all of it. And people want certain things from the state, but they want just enough that the state has facilitated participation, things like that. So I guess that would be my nirvana, as we can get through the next 30 years peacefully and make the necessary changes so that our children and grandchildren can live relatively decent lives on this planet, and that we do that with peaceful democracy. And I think that how we deal with our welfare system is going to be really critical to whether or not we can make that journey.
Thank you. Maybe we can share, and you two share that one, and we share that one, right?
Okay, yeah. Thank you for the invitation to this panel. I'm happy to be here. Since you're talking about utopias, I would say my utopia is full employment, no more unemployment. And since Andrew talked about peaceful democracy, the last time we lost peaceful democracy in the 1930s, at least in say, the Western countries, was when mass unemployment happened as a consequence of the financial crisis and the wrong response to the financial crisis. And so preventing, and in a way the rise of right-wing parties, fascist parties, the collapse of centrist parties in Europe at the moment, and also in the United States, is connected to that lack of, I would say, a vision of full employment of those centrist parties. And so I would like to, so the job guarantee, I think, is as a utopia or as a vision. It means that you bring back full employment, you bring back a strong state that actually says and admits and wants to do something for its people instead of just managing underemployment and unemployment. So let me explain, for those of you that haven't heard, what a job guarantee is. Let me briefly explain to you what it is. At the moment, it's politically quite relevant in the United States. It's been an idea that was taken up by Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the new shooting star of the American left. They've advocated an idea that even 10 years ago would have been considered crazy by most mainstream economists, the Trop Guarantee. And what it means is that everybody who wants can get an offer by the government for a publicly funded job. Okay, and that job would be paid would pay a minimum wage salary, a salary that you can live off, not super comfortably, but comfortably. And you would have also a social insurance or benefits package that comes with it, so like health insurance and other types of social benefits. So obviously you would have to create a public employment sector or a job guarantee sector that has a lot of jobs. Now what should these jobs be? There's a lot of these jobs would probably be in the social sector. To give one example, in Austria we had a very minor pilot program for a job guarantee. And one of the jobs was to help the elderly that are still living at home. They're old, they have troubles getting their groceries, somebody needs to look after them, but they're not really old enough to have to go to a retirement home. And so some of the people that were hired in this pilot program in Austria were people that check up on them, that help them get the groceries. These jobs need to be additional, they shouldn't replace any existing private or public sector jobs, and they should be meaningful, right? So the society, jobs that fulfill a need for the society. And the program is of course totally voluntary, so nobody's forced when they're unemployed to take up such a job. You can choose to stay in the regular unemployment benefit system, but if you have enough of it, if you've written 100 applications and the employers don't even reply to you anymore, then you can take up this publicly financed job. And so that's the basic concept. The government provides a public job for anyone willing, able, and ready to work. And the goal of this, or the vision of this, is here that everybody contributes to society, right? So there's an inclusion, you're included in society, not only by having friends, by having parents and children and so on, right? But you're also included into society by having a work that you're doing for society, right? You're working in a team, you're working at an office or anywhere else, you're producing something, and that gives you meaning, it gives you identity, it gives you self-worth, it gives you self-respect, it gives you the respect of others. So like work and having a job is a lot more than just having income, although that is, for anyone who doesn't have a job obviously the most important thing. A job guarantee essentially tries to erase these costs of unemployment. It tries to erase the psychological strain, the health damage that you get from being unemployed. It tries to erase the fear of being unemployed and never finding a job again that a lot of people have that are not well qualified. A lot of people have that are, when they're getting too old. I mean, employers discriminate based on age, right? In Austria, if you're over 50, try to get a job, good luck, right? If you become unemployed. There was a study done in 2013 in the middle of the crisis. If you're over 50 and you're long-term unemployed, so unemployed for more than a year, then you only 1 in 20 persons found a job in the next 1.5 years, and everybody else didn't, right? So for those people, a job guarantee would be perfect. And yeah, that's basically the first vision of the job guarantee.
Okay, thank you.
Hello. I have to admit it's really strange to speak English in Slovenia. But I will try. Well, and I'm going to be not only short, but I would like to go above all of what I said about basic income already. I mean, I do believe that most of you read something about universal basic income, maybe saw what I wrote, and that I don't need to explain everything in detail. Nevertheless, I will explain definition of universal basic income for maybe listeners who don't know. So universal basic income is unconditional monthly paid income which is a right for everyone unconditionally. And what do we usually mean by unconditionally is it's not connected with the willingness to work, and it doesn't matter how rich you are, you will get basic income in any case. So that's definition. About utopia and how basic income goes together with all ideas we heard before. I believe it's complementary, and in my utopia it looks like that. We had universal basic services. We have free, unconditional job guarantee. And above all, we have universal basic income as a last resort. So that not people won't be, have a fear because of unemployment, but they won't have any fear for any reason at all, to be hungry or to be without shelter, without a place where to stay. Because you see, even if we have universal basic services, I mean, they can be very comprehensive, I believe. But nevertheless, if we go about jobs, you know, I started with the idea of basic income because people were employed, but they were not paid for what they did. So that was the problem. And then you have sick people, you have old people, you have people who don't know how to go to or to find all those services. So basic income is really the last safety net. And it has to be unconditional so that no one needs to go to school or to lawyer or, I don't know, to think about it, how to get that money. The money will come to you. Of course, the main problem, what I was working on for the last 10 years is how big universal basic income can be to satisfy the conditions, Adrian said before, you know, the question of taxes and freedom. I mean, because what are we prepared to sacrifice for a freedom universal basic income can provide? And that's mainly that. No one should be hungry. No one should be afraid for the next day. That's my utopia.
Okay, thank you. Now, before we dive into the specifics of these proposals and what are the advantages and maybe the shortcomings, maybe we can agree on something, because on the surface at least, all of the three proposals have unconditionality, right? Unconditional right to income, to jobs, like everyone can take them, or to services, and that's independent of one's personal circumstances, but like, I don't know, race, gender, sexuality, of course, but also importantly income, and then you tweak the tax system to make it progressive, but the right itself is unconditional. Would we all agree that that is a necessary part of any welfare system?
Yes, I believe so.
Well, let me just, so in the job guarantee, like you can be fired, right? Like if you don't, like you get an employment offer, you take up the public job, but if you don't, if you don't show up to work in the morning, you would get fired, right? So then you would fall back on the social welfare system that is in place in the country for people like that. But it's, I mean, it's not, you don't, if you don't come to work, right, you don't keep getting offered a job and job and job, right? So there is like you get an unconditional right to a job offer, but it doesn't mean that you can't be fired or that the company that employs you, the public company, has to put up with everything you do, right? So the offer is unconditional, but it's not necessarily, yeah, I mean, it's not a total unconditionality, if you know what I mean. Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry, the question was for the social state and all the services and everything?
No, like whichever model we pursue, whether we give the right to a job or the right to an income or the right to services like healthcare, education, whatever, housing, transport, whatever we decided, it's important that the right is unconditional for everyone.
Well, it depends. I would say, I always say it has to be unconditional and universal, but on the minimum level. So it's basic level. So I'm not talking about, like totalitarian state which has only one level of services, of one level of income. We are going to talk about unconditional basic level. And it has to be then added with like earned income and the maybe market institutions. We are not talking about the one pillar. We are talking about the social welfare, which is made from 2 or 3 pillars. I usually say we have universal, then we have social. I mean, our insurance system, which is a solidarity system. And then we have also market insurance system. So we are talking about 3 pillars.
Is this on? I don't have anything to add other than to confirm that that's exactly what I was trying to say earlier about this not 100% of one thing or another. That we are, I think, all talking about unconditionality within the context of a society that also has a competitive market economy and other things. This is about a welfare system, not about a total economy.
Okay, nevertheless, the goal of the welfare state is to make people less dependent on market relations in order to sustain some socially acceptable standard of living, right? So we have 3 different approaches here to achieve that. Universal basic income would give minimum but still basic income to everyone regardless of whether they work or not. The job guarantee would try to intervene basically in the job market and make it less oppressive, I guess, kind of.
If you will, yeah.
And the basic services would take some of the services that everyone needs out of the market actually and provide them on a needs basis rather than a market basis, right? So question to all 3, why is that the right approach to lessen the grip of the market on some basic living standard?
There's quite a lot to say about that. I quite like Joseph Stiglitz wrote an article that just came out this week. He's an American economist. I highly recommend reading that. It is an insight from inside the most pro-capitalist economy that we have by quite an erudite and experienced economist. And he calls this need to provide what he would call public options. And what he means by that is that in any particular space, particularly not in any space, that in the core most basic functions of society, in the core most basic needs of every human, there should be an option for the public service. And that's what we talk about as well in our report on basic services. So what we're proposing is not that all public transport should necessarily be free and provided for by a state-owned bus company. It is simply that the state ensures that the basic level of transport functionality to allow people to live their lives is available as a public option. People still can have their own private modes of transport and 1,000 million other options that there might be in a market state. In the UK, we already have a fully functioning, non-insurance-based national healthcare system. And we still have private medicine, and people still go to private doctors, and there's still private insurance of people. So just that's two examples. You could look at education. In each of these markets, the private portion of it might be very small, and that's fine, but I think it's important to lay out the thing that we're not setting out here to be a sort of a legally exclusive monopoly in the particular areas of certain services. The important thing is to make sure that people have access to those services if they have no money, if that is a particularly bad year, bad month for them, or 1,000 other social circumstances which might result in someone not wanting to or not being able to access private market versions of those services. And so the other thing that I would say about where this applies and why is it okay to have this kind of intervention in certain parts of the market and not others is I would again direct you towards some work done at the Manchester University School on what they would call a foundational economy. That actually when you look at our economy and you drill down into what is going on in what we think of as one single bucket, the reality is more than half of the activity in that economy is very basic services. It is housing, it is energy provision, it is food. It is the things that everybody needs and uses already. It's not the sort of, banking-based, hedge fund-funded, competitive, tradable economy in cell phones. That is a much smaller part of our total economy. And in many of these sectors, the idea that a competition exists is purely a political conjecture. In the UK, we privatized our telephone company. I believe you may have thought about doing it here recently as well, back in the 80s. And what did we do? We took one town in the whole country and said, okay, the national telephone company does not have a monopoly here. We're going to create one new company. And the town is called Hull, and it's called Kingston Communications, and they still exist today. In 90% of the rest of the country, still the primary dominant provider is the basic national telephone company, so much so that even our Conservative government is talking about bringing the company that does the wiring in the streets back into public ownership. So there's 2 points to take away here. One is, certainly in universal basic services, and I think we're the only one here advocating the public provision directly of services, so I can say this, there's no intention here to be 100% provider or an exclusive monopoly provider in any of these areas. And the second is to pay attention to the fact that in much of the economy anyway, the idea that there is competition is not true. So you may as well have a socially orientated, funded, and motivated provider in that space who's prepared to work with the rest of society.
It's your choice.
Well, if I may, because actually for the last local elections, I wrote a piece about universal basic services as well. But it was only on the local level. You see, I always think about this problem in Slovenian terms. So my starting point is we already have universal social healthcare, universal education system, which is free as well. So the only problem which was left out was social security. So that's why I went there. But on the local level, I can picture this approach, which I call universal, basic, unconditional approach, not only income, we can use on anything. I did examples for the library cards. I mean, it's not that you have to go to the library and have each book for free. You can get one book per month for free. You can get bus ride once per month for a start, I mean. Then we talked a lot about, for instance, that each citizen should get free electricity or a basic amount again. So every service can be built upon this approach. So universal basic, and then solidarity system, and then market system. But you were asking which one is better. I mean, because I have a problem then when I stop thinking about universal basic services. For instance, food. Are we going, because like food stamps and food banks can be a little bit thought as universal basic services. I mean, you see, there is a problem. Are we going back to the food stamps? And then we can start to feel where is the problem with both proposals of my predecessors. I mean, about work and services. It's about free choice of people. It's a choice that you can decide for yourself because you have the money for completely stupid idea what you are going to eat. You know, we have a lot of discussion about vegan without gluten and so on. I mean, it's a really important thing, being free to decide what you want. And for job guarantee, you know what is the problem. I mean, because before we started to talk about basic income, we went through the thinking, if maybe your way is better and your way. Because we agree that the job gives or gave identity to the people very strongly. But then you said, well, you get self-respect. Oh, really? With a shit work? I mean, not really. So, you see, it is really the point that only basic income is like really the last resort when you can say no, even to the best mentioned social engineering. Thank you.
So I would say that each of the approaches solves a different problem. So basic services tries to guarantee you a certain standard of living, even though your job may not, even when your job doesn't pay you the money that you would need for that certain standard of living, right? Universal basic income tries to free you from the coercion to sell your labor to get an income to live a decent life. And a job guarantee tries to free you from unemployment, right? So from not being able to get that job, to have that income and the freedom to live the life that you like, right? So I think they all solve different problems, and I think whether whether the problem that you want to solve, you consider the most important one, is a bit of a choice, of course. But I think where we have to think about a bit how the individual proposals fit into the existing system and how easily you can realize them. And there I would say like a job guarantee, if it's not, if you don't start with the job guarantee where the government immediately guarantees a job to anyone who wants it, whether they're unemployed or not, but if you start with smaller projects where you say, okay, everybody who has been unemployed for 3 years gets that offer of a public job, right? So you start small, you observe what happens. Then typically, the cost is different for every country. Every country has different unemployment rates. But typically, you're going to find some eligibility criteria that are affordable for a certain country. Germany obviously will be able to. They might even be able to do a general job guarantee right away because the unemployment rate is low and they don't have any financing problems. For countries in a crisis like Greece, obviously you will have to start with a smaller program. And the advantage of the job guarantee is that it does fit into the existing system quite easily, because you don't have to change your unemployment benefit system. You don't have to change your any health insurance system. You don't have to change your idea of freedom, right? Like in basic income. You can start it and you can leave your existing welfare system, whether you have one or not, intact, and just go with it. I think it's a very practical example, and it only solves a certain problem, right? It solves the problem of unemployment. If you have a completely broken healthcare system, like in the United States, a job guarantee can, of course, be help if health insurance is included in that. But if the health insurance is not that good and hospital prices in the US are terrible, right, then it might not completely fix the problem, right? So that's if your housing market explodes, then the minimum wage may not be enough to finance you. So obviously it doesn't solve every problem, but there's a practical advantage. And if you successively, if it turns out to be successful, these pilot programs, and you successively include more and more people into the job guarantee, then you could eventually end up at some form of full employment that we had in the 1970s and that we in the Western economies, and that we've never had since then, because we weren't able to do what you need to do, which is, economists call it anti-cyclical fiscal policy, which means every time you have a recession, every time you have unemployment, the state spends more, intervenes, and tries to get people to work. And we've never managed that since the 1970s, essentially, or the early 80s, right? That was the last time that we had some form of full employment where it was not a problem to find a job. And ever since then, there are increasing groups that cannot find a job. And with the job guarantee, you would put in place an institution that stays, right, that guarantees that no matter whether you have an upswing or a downswing, no matter what the unemployment rate is, there's an institution that you get a publicly funded job. Yeah.
If I may, I think you made two very legitimate criticisms and of the other two proposals. One is that you said the basic income gives you freedom to choose, and I think it's important to recognize that besides the basic needs that we all share and the state can more or less easily provide, there are needs that are very diverse and that can only be met by monetary exchange, right? And that's something that the UBS kind of doesn't solve, or it falls back to some conditional cash transfers, and then you again have the problem of conditionality and all the problem that brings from, the welfare, so-called welfare traps, and the humiliation it brings, and so on. And for the job guarantee, it's hard to, I mean, if the aim is to free people from the oppression of the job market, it's hard to argue that these job guarantee jobs will be less alienating and, you know, more fulfilling than the private sector ones. So you basically just make another option for being forced to sell your labor in, right? Maybe if you'd like to respond.
Yeah. Actually, someone else go first, because
Yeah. No.
May I?
Okay.
May I, please?
Okay.
Because, well, about this job guarantee. You
Go
see,
ahead.
You were really up to the point when you said that the problem is how it's done and in which system is done. So in our country we have javna dela, public work. So you see, the people who are not employed for a few years, they can get a job, but the job is like paycheck is uniform, is very low, is lower than minimum income because it's not a wage. It's some kind of active employment policy. So I've read about it in the UK, the horror stories that if you work in museum, you lose your job. Why? Because they can employ you through public service, public work for the third paycheck. I mean, for the third, za tretjino plače. Torej, well, they can Google.
Maybe, I don't know.
But don't mistake me. I know Slovenians, and I know they love to work. And I know that they feel with you, you know? They would all like these job guarantees. Of course they would. So, what we started in our organization, we started to think how to get some kind of a piece of proper work, you know, not of this public work. We want to take 2 hours out of work of 8 hours. So we went to the discussion about the shorter working week. And we said, well, if we take some well-paid hours and we can distribute them to the unemployed, we will get full employment as well. So the people shouldn't be forced to get public work. They should get an opportunity to see whatever work they want and apply for it. That's my utopia, the second one.
I will reply. So I think what you call proper work is a nice word to start to reply. So with the universal basic income, the basic problem that I see there is that if you pay everybody an unconditional basic income that they can live off comfortably, then
Basic.
yeah, basic. But I mean, you know, but not starving, not, you know, like.
That's not comfortable.
Okay. Whatever, minimum wage, right? Like some or equivalent to some minimum wage. No, less than that. Okay. So that you can only sit at home and watch TV, or is that okay? No. Anyways, if you do that and it's at a level where you can reasonably opt not to work, then a lot of people might do that. And then if a lot of people do that, then who will sit at the supermarket as a cashier and get the money that you pay for groceries, right? Nobody will do it anymore. Who will work? Who will clean the toilets in the hostel that I'm sleeping at, right? Like, I mean, I certainly wouldn't do it if the alternative is to get receive a basic income without having to go to work. So then the reply of the universal basic income people is then, well, these are jobs that then would have to just be paid at a higher rate, right? Nobody likes to do these jobs, so the wage has to rise. But the problem is if too many people withdraw from jobs that are necessary for society to keep the functioning of society or to keep the provision of basic services that everybody needs, then you will get a big problem. You will get an inflation problem, right? Prices will start to rise for these. And the basic income that is paid out as a nominal amount, right? To say, I don't know what it would be in Slovenia, say 600 euros, 700 euros, and then that will not be enough anymore to pay for all the things that you want to pay. So then it's not an unconditional basic income anymore if prices start to rise for everything. So there's a problem if too many people withdraw their labor supply, if withdraw their work, then you will not be able to finance to supply in society what you need in terms of services. And the job guarantee circumvents that problem because in the job guarantee you make sure that everybody who receives that income from the from the government also has to contribute to society, also has to do a job that is between what society needs, right? So it's determined by local administration or central administration or like by the state. What do we need, right? What services do we need? Proper work, right? Meaningful, and what are the skills of the unemployed? And then you match that together, and you produce something that is valuable to society. Whereas in the basic income, basically you get the same amount of money, say, but not like if everybody just decides to go to be an artist and paint paintings, then who is going to grow the food, right? Who is going to build the houses that we need and so on, right? That's the difference, I think.
Sorry, I really have to. I mean, I hope the public knows me already, so they maybe already know what I'm going to say. But first of all, again, and I'm going to be really strong in my claims now. You see, we can get full employment if we establish again working camps. Isn't that true?
Yes, but
isn't that true? I mean,
yes, but that is a workfare program, and that is not a job guarantee. I mean, that is not what I'm advocating, right? So, yes,
I'm
you can
sorry.
do that.
I mean, for the state, there is no problem to force people to work for nothing, just for food. So that's the problem with job guarantees. And I have to say you are not actually fair because you didn't explain, I mean, you didn't overthrow my counter-arguments, and then what you did is like talking about counter-arguments for basic income. And I can say they're all wrong. First of all, the point is, what you said, it's true for basic income as well. The point is, it's the most important, the way how you introduce basic income. So I did calculations, I did microsimulation. And what I proposed is that if we start with basic income on the same level of minimum social support, it's the same as now. You see, and you said with the job guarantee, if you don't change anything in the system with the amount of money, there is no inflation. There is no change in the money flows. The only thing we change is the way how we introduce support. Without bureaucracy, without conditionality, without... That's the key. Exactly. And then you were talking about, I'm sorry, toilet cleaners. And then about proper jobs. You see, that's kind of not very honest. You said, well, the job should give self-respect, and then we talk about shit jobs. Isn't that true? I mean, and then the problem is, who is going to do shit job?
But I mean, you did say that it would be, that job would pay a minimum wage, right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Should I reply, or maybe just very quickly? Yeah, okay. So firstly, I don't necessarily think any of these jobs are shit jobs, because like often the people that do them have a certain, I mean, they're proud of their jobs, you know, like if you're you can also say a policeman is a shit job, right? Because you're like, often they have long shifts, it's a very tough job, you have a higher risk of getting killed or injured. But often the people that do them are very proud of the contribution to society that they make, right? So I don't necessarily think these are shit jobs, but in your critique on the job guarantee, I would say that anything can be done in a wrong way. And there's enough public works programs and there's enough public employment programs that have been done the wrong way. Some of them have been introduced by conservative governments that were, the only purpose was to hide unemployment, right? And they were just, there's a German example in the 90s of Eastern Germany, right? There was full employment before, communist full employment. And then suddenly there was unemployment. So what the conservative government tried to do, they did all these public jobs, and they were not proper jobs. They were not meaningful jobs to society. Like in one example, they replaced the one the one guy who was mowing the law with 10 people who were picking up the leaves and like mowing the law manually, right? So that is obviously nonsense, right? Like you don't want to do that. That is crap, right? But this is not what job guarantee advocates have in mind. Like there's a clear selection of the jobs. It is clear that the jobs need to be additional, and it is clear that the jobs must not replace any existing public sector jobs. So exactly what you were describing before of saying, you know, the public sector discovers we can replace existing jobs with those cheaper job guarantee jobs with the minimum wage. That has to be explicitly ruled out. One way to do it, if you do not introduce a general job guarantee right away, but if you introduce a limited job guarantee, say for only a certain part of the long-term unemployed that fulfills certain criteria, well then you can actually, if you do that, then you can actually pay a higher wage than the minimum wage. You can actually pay the wage that is in the collective bargaining agreements. And so that ensures that the jobs will not replace anybody, because it's essentially the same salary according to the collective bargaining agreements. So there's various ways to ensure it. As always, you can do things wrong, and you can do things deliberately wrong with the wrong intention. But I don't think that necessarily disqualifies the idea.
Yeah, I think we're all subject to that sort of rule. I mean, public services can be done very badly as well, and we get a lot of feedback in the UK about the old British rail service, which was sort of notoriously unfriendly and unreliable. And but I guess what I would say at this point is that, in some ways, I think what may be probably obvious is that we're all sort of pointing at systems that try to achieve something quite similar overall, which is to take fear out of society so that our citizens contribute their best skills and participate in decision making, which is what's going to make it a good place to live. And so this argument about cash or no cash, for instance, is It's a straw man, as we would say. It's a false argument, because we're not talking about universal basic services as some replacement for the cash system. And so when we put our report, we were very specific about two things. One is that the existing conditional benefits system, which certainly in the UK, and I'm going to guess it's really not that different in most European countries, for the working age population, most of state support goes to disabled people, people who are incapacitated in some form or another from participating in the rest of the economy. And we left that in place. We also modeled in our report what I would call a small basic income. Now, I've stopped calling it a small basic income because I've been told by basic income people that there's no such thing. So I don't know what else to call it. So if it's a basic income, it should be just about enough to live off. What? Partial, yeah. Sounds like we're going sort of like it's a step. I don't know, we call it basic pocket money or something. But what we did when we did our report is we modeled something very, very basic, and I'm trying to think exactly whether it was £25 a week or £30 a week. So let's call it 30 or 40 euros a week, as a cash supplement on top of these services. So the first point to make here is that I think that it's a false dichotomy to say we're talking about cash or we're talking about services. When we come to food, there's an interesting discussion to be had about community food programs that might be able to meet all of the different dietary requirements of a particular population, and whether that should therefore definitely be covered under a cash program. When it comes to healthcare, I don't see anybody arguing that we should go to a money-based system. So it's not one or the other. It is going to be that there are some needs that are covered by cash, and there are some that are definitely, and they're quite big, covered by services. So the question then becomes, what can you afford to do as a society? How do you reach this objective, and what are the most efficient ways to get there? And so it's in that context that I think that basic income has a lot of work to do, because a lot of the modeling that's been done so far on anything large is that you have to churn a lot of money through changes in the tax system to deliver quite small amounts of money to individual peoples at the end. And we would argue that there's a sort of limit to how much you can push around the tax system. This is back to a practical point about how do you get from where you are to this next system, and the ability to leave the benefit system in place, largely leave the tax system in place with small amounts to cover it. Our universal basic program was 2% of GDP. It required an average of about £25 a week from the people who are at the higher end of the tax system. These were no changes there, and we were building on something that already exists in most places, public services, and expanding those. So it's a very practical solution. The thing about basic income is that once you move from partial or very small into anything larger, you have quite wholesale reorganizations of the system. And all of the modeling that's been done so far has shown it's very hard to keep. The trouble with the conditional benefit system is it's really effective at meeting people who have particular needs. So it's very good at getting to disabled people. It's very good at getting to certain types of family groups and certain disadvantages. And we may all dislike its conditionality, but it's very hard to take that same amount of money, make it unconditional, and still hit the need points that were hit by the conditional system. So, the jury's out, as far as I'm concerned, as to how much we can do on an unconditional cash distribution. It's not that there isn't room for some, and there definitely is space and should be for a level of cash distribution that is need-targeted in our societies. I think the question comes down to how much tax are we prepared to pay, and what's the most efficient way to use that tax money to achieve the objective we're all trying to get to, which is to reduce fear and increase the confidence of people to be able to participate in their societies. And it's that maths and that modeling that has led us to this point where we go, the easy, practical, immediate, effective, efficient, and really helpfully environmentally sensitive way to make those gains is to look at investing in the public services to, as far as you can think of taking it today. Maybe community food programs is beyond where you want to go, but we can make real progress with free local transport straight off, basic internet and phone access. These kinds of services are really no-brainers, not that expensive, and I think that's where I'd like to make sure that your impression of where universal basic services is coming from is that it's about this very practical, like, what moves can we do now to shore up our society, to ensure that we continue with peaceful democracy, to meet our climate change objectives. That those are the things that we're particularly focused on when we talk about this idea of basic services.
Okay, maybe I'd like to move to a practical problem that we're facing, that is the precarization of the labor market. And I guess we have two different approaches here. One is the basic income or the basic services approach, would try to make, basically recognizes that that is where the labor market is going and tries to make it easier for people to handle it. So in a sense, it's similar to where the current welfare state came from, right? To kind of legitimize exploitative practices by ameliorating the largest successes, right? The job guarantee, I'm not sure. I mean, it depends what kind of jobs this would be, but it could be a way to try to prevent the precarization if a state would guarantee a decent paying job. So maybe, how do you...
Should I start? Yeah. So the central, or one of the central aspects of the job guarantee is that it effectively sets a minimum standard in the labor market, right? It sets a floor, essentially, that a certain wage, a certain social insurance and social benefits package, and also certain working conditions standards are met in the public sector job. So you can always switch to that if private sector employers don't fulfill that standard, right? So through that, it sets this effective minimum standard. And everybody in precarious work, everybody with a boss that treats them awfully, and everybody with a private sector wage that is below the job guarantee sector wage has the option of moving into the job guarantee sector, right? So that standard is being set, and in that sense, it definitely helps exactly those people that need it, provided, of course, they're willing to take a job guarantee job, right? Which may not be the case for everybody. But what it also does, I think, even if you start with a smaller program, or if you start with a limited program, say a job guarantee that only includes the long-term unemployed, it still can have that function of strengthening workers' bargaining power, so that they themselves, through unions or without unions, can negotiate for themselves a higher wage, better benefits, better working conditions. Why? Because, we saw this very clearly in Germany when they introduced the Hartz IV reforms, that even though people that were in a good job, had even in a really good company, they were afraid to negotiate better wages because they thought, okay, if I lose my job, then I will go into this Hartz IV system, which will mean I will end up with nothing and I will be treated like shit by the government, right? Whereas if alternatively, if you lose your job, then the worst thing that can happen to me is I end up in a proper job guarantee job. Maybe not the salary that I had before, but it's still going to be decent work. It's still gonna contribute to society. Then, and I'm not going to end up in unemployment. I don't have to sit at home for the next years. Then that still strengthens your bargaining power. It still strengthens your mental mindset when you face your boss in saying, hey, why do I have 3 short-term contracts. You know, I want an unlimited contract, right? So if you don't give me that, like, why do the unemployed people get it, right? Like, so it sets, even a limited program would set a standard that has a positive influence on society to have higher wages and set a certain standard in working conditions.
Well, I have to say, I would just like to see the political proposition of that in detail, and because actually I cannot imagine if I try really hard how in this system of globalization, automatization, something like what we hear from you can work. I cannot imagine, really. I mean, you see...
But regarding the precarization... So
yes, regarding precarization. I mean, for instance, we have precariat not only in the private economy, we have precariat at the universities. You all know that. I mean, this is state employment. So state is doing that.
But wouldn't the UBI just make it easier
I'm not
to
talking
do
about
such
UBI, I'm just contra-argumenting his idea. So, I mean, I'm trying to help him to think his concept.
Well, I appreciate that, but
Well,
I can also think of for myself.
No, because as I said, I do agree that the work is important. I do. It's important for identity and to inclusion and anything like that. But I will give you a hint. So the problem is because you are talking about small approach with a section of people. If you are going to do it and you want that it works, it has to be universal for all people of working age, you know. Because what we have right now is like, okay, for older people, right, but the employer wants to employ the really good working girl of 45. No, he cannot, because she has to be 50. You see, because we have these special arrangements. So what we see that this kind of tiptoeing, I don't know what is the right term of flexibilization that is just playing workers all around through the different kind of game. We have to say stop. We are on the basic level all human beings and we deserve the same treatment, not different kind of people of 50 and more, because we have people of 30 who have the same problem. Actually, I don't think your idea is good enough right now. So, but I have to talk to him. I have to say something about universal basic services. I've heard of you. I mean, people will laugh again, but I will still say, you should be sorry that you couldn't read my proposal because it's in Slovenia, you know. I wrote there about activation voucher as a part of basic income. It's like a form which it could be used as education voucher or activation voucher also in the sense that people could work, get paid, but not with the work that state will provide, but that the work they will invent for themselves, you know, neighborhood work, or in a way of time banking. So I did include that, and I'm not like going contra-argumenting for the sake. I mean, we think about it. And we agree that all approaches has to be used. Which one is the best one in the moment, it has to be used. But the main point is for the full employment and precariat. You see, what we have right now in Slovenia, we talk and hear a lot that we don't have enough of workers anymore. But if I ask the public, can they feel it? Is there full employment? Is there fair wages? They are not. So you see, it's already not enough workers, but there is still not enough push for the government and society to give the fair fair approach for everyone. So.
Can I? Have I got time?
Precarization, yeah.
Yeah. I kind of love this question. I want to sort of repeat what I think I heard. So, ameliorating the extractive practices of voracious businesses is that what a welfare system does? I kind of like this question because it goes to the heart of something that I think we all need to actually reconceptualize for ourselves. The economy is the child of the society. We are not the children of our economy. All businesses are already children and are already looked after and already only exist because of the situations that we create for them. We educate the people, we create the legal system. By creating more safety and security for our individual citizens, we are not ameliorating the extractive practices of business any more than we are by educating our children. It is a false image of the society that you live in, that we all live in. Business is not that big, business is not that important. And what we do to make sure that our lives are worth living, fun, full of joy, prosperous, right, is fair game. It doesn't matter. If that reduces the cost of the business, that's fine. They were a child of our society in the first place. So I don't buy the premise, I guess.
Okay. No, I thought, okay, never mind. Yeah. Anyway, we'll open the floor for the questions. So, is there a question from the audience?
Actually, I had the feeling that we never moved away from the first question. So I think that we were constantly describing this utopian state, but what I find missing was a question of, how to say, political strategy. I think, to be a bit sarcastic, how many research papers does it take to convince the policymakers?
Shall I go first? Well, the good news is that I think that it's quite easy for politicians to pick this up. So in the UK, the Labour Party has picked up what they've done with it is they've turned it into relatively small policy offers. So they are proposing to provide free public transport for people under 25 who live in towns that have municipalized their bus services. But the answer is you push as hard as you can, but I think that picking up on public services expansion is something that's quite easy for politicians to do, and we're seeing some sign of it in the UK.
So it only takes one research paper, because one is enough to describe the idea, and the rest has, but you know, it's not, one research paper is not enough. You need to have political momentum on your side. How does a party win elections? By putting forward popular proposals that solve the problems of society, right? And if you poll a job guarantee, if you poll should the government provide a job for long-term unemployed people that cannot find a job anymore, then there are a large majority of people that say yes to that. In the United States, they found that the job guarantee proposal is one of the most favorable issues that they have ever polled, right? So among Democrats, it has a huge majority, and even among Republicans, it's like almost 50-50. So it's like, well, so you just had, the idea is pretty new. I mean, the idea is not that new, but it has arrived only now. Could the economists that were proposing this convince some politicians to take it up in the form of Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, this new generation that is trying to take over the Democratic Party, which was previously captured, I would say, by some financial interests. And there's a new generation that doesn't take money from Wall Street firms and big corporations. And actually, I mean, the best chance of seeing something like this implemented is if Bernie Sanders becomes president next year. And then you also get enough seats in Congress with progressive candidates to actually put this forward in the US. But I think the issue is extremely popular because you will see in the presidential primaries among the Democrats, you will see almost all candidates have a job guarantee proposal. So I think these ideas are really coming now, right? And in Europe, we're not at that stage yet. The discussion is not. I've tried to convince the Austrian Social Democratic Party to take it up, and they're slowly moving in that direction. I wouldn't say they haven't taken it up yet, but they're more open to the ideas than they ever were before, right? And 5 years ago, they would have never even touched something like this because. So I think we're at a unique historical moment still, 10 years after the financial crisis, with high unemployment, with precarious work, where people are craving new solutions, and either the right is going to give them those perceived solutions by blaming everything on foreign workers and foreigners and migration, or the left is going to give them those solutions in the form of some realistic but visionary concepts, because people don't have a trust in these centrist solutions anymore because they don't work anymore, right? So, or some of them don't work anymore, and they're still, yeah.
I'm sorry, do you really want me to speak about Slovenian state? Should I? Okay. So, you know, there is only one suggestion how to, and one proposal and one calculation of introducing basic income in Slovenia. And it's mine, and it's almost 10 years old. So I have to say, actually, I believe it was so good that no one could do it better. So that's why it's the only one, and it only takes one. So, okay, here you go. But then, the point is, maybe it's interesting for you too. You see, in last 10 years, we really got to the level that almost any political party in Slovenia, or all of them, are for basic income. But the point is that they picture it very differently. And actually, I have to say, you see, my proposition was with the same tax system, with the same amount of money, we can introduce basic income. So the question about how much or if we afford, it's non-existing in my proposal. And the microsimulation shows it works. So the question is why politicians didn't take an idea. Why didn't they? Because they just enjoy the state of things that they are. I mean, why should they change it? We should change it. And where are we? But we shouldn't
But
be
I mean,
we shouldn't be pessimistic. I have an idea. Trade unions, Lydia Jerkic, during these first May holidays, she was on the TV and she said, yes, we should start thinking about shorter working week and universal basic income. And you know, she is the head of the biggest trade union coordination. So we should be optimistic, I say.
Is there another question?
I have a question for Mr. Percy, and it is what has universal basic services have to say about housing? Particularly in countries like UK, where we have this enormous difference in expenditures people need for living in, let's say, London or other rural Scotland or something. And does need to be subsidized proportionally to the places, or should be government encourage people to move to more affordable places or something?
Housing is a problem in a lot of countries, and luckily we had a chance to chat about this a little bit earlier. It's less of a problem, interestingly, in Austria, and the reason is because they have a lot of social housing, and that you can have a small private market on the side of a market that is still fundamentally has a huge portion of it which is available at cost. Because the trouble here is the difference between the cost of the housing in terms of what it costs to build and maintain and allow people to live in it, and the market value as it ends up being in this environment. So, our answer, I think the only answer to that in most places around the world is that there needs to be a substantial portion of the market that is publicly provided, publicly owned, and provided for what would be called social rents or at-cost rent. And that is the answer on the housing market. For those who might have actually, and I doubt anyone's here, and that's fine, who've actually read the report that we put out in 2017, we did say that what we were trying to do was model the costs of this. And so just a quick caveat, in that report we said 1.5 million housing units free of rent, £1,000 a year utilities, and no local taxes on those properties. And I think I just take the point to say that what we're trying to do is estimate the costs of a massive intervention on the housing market, rather than actually insist that you would build 1.5 million houses and those people would get to rent free and everyone else would have to pay. It's not actually the way that you would do it. The housing market, I think, has to be a blended market, and in much like everything else that we've talked about here, that there is this balance between how much exists on the private space and how much exists on the public space. And where our housing has got out of kilter, and particularly in the UK, it's because the public side has been pushed down and we have not built anywhere near enough social housing units to accommodate for the demand that exists. And so we are now spend $28 billion a year subsidizing private rents for people who can't afford to live there. We could take half that money and pay for a massive social housing program. But I don't think it's that different in a lot of other countries except Singapore, Austria, places that have massive social housing ownership.
But it's still a conditional right? It's not that everyone would get
I don't know.
Unconditionally.
So I'll repeat what I think I've already said on Twitter or somewhere else. We should just keep building social houses till there aren't any people left who want one.
I just have a short question regarding universal basic income. I never got the bit about why does everybody need to get it? Why do the rich need universal basic income? It sounds nice, but what's the point really?
the question is very easy to answer. Really. In that way, you can get rid of administration. Administration that has to measure each person who deserves and who doesn't. You see, actually, that's the point. That's the main point. But there is a little twist in it as well. You see, we have in Slovenia the system that measures poor people very, very diligently and tight. We check everything. And on the other side, we have the rich people with all these tax loops or tax exemptions. And we don't check them. But if we get them all in the same system, you see, we can check the rich as well. So that's the answer.
Okay, I think we'll have to end here because we have another panel coming up in 15 minutes or maybe half an hour. If it will, sorry?
Just because it was brought up, and it is interesting, and I would encourage you to go and read the Green New Deal. This is AOC's proposal to the American Congress. It is completely lacking in detail, so it's very easy to read, and you will get through it. It's about 2 or 3 pages long. But what is interesting about it is, one, that the priority is, that puts climate adaptation and transition right at the top of the priority list, and I think that that's really great. The second is that it puts some level of social safety, security, whatever it takes for us to feel like we are part of one society, up at the top. And then as you go through it, you will find that there's a ton of stuff in there that looks like many of the proposals you've heard of tonight. Because not only is there a job guarantee in there, but there's a ton of stuff on housing, on transport, on healthcare. So it is a very interesting document and a useful one to use as a sort of rallying point. And I think that it would cover a lot of what we've talked about tonight. And it's easily accessible. You can find it on the internet.
Which is a great conclusion. Thank you very much. Vsi, ki ste tukaj, ostanite še na naslednji debati. Boris Vasov se bo pogovarjal z Zlatkom Dizdarevićem o Bližnjem vzhodu. Naslov je Bližnji vzhod kot geopolitična šahovnica. Hvala, da ste poslušali in ostanite kle.